The blood road to camp is a negotiation with supply. Shield boards and spear poles are lashed into brancards. Contubernales carry their own where mules cannot go. Mullions wheel wagons down a corridor pre-cleared by pickets. Some carts are stripped to serve as ambulances, others remain piled with grain. The legate chooses food over comfort because an army without bread soon ceases to be an army. The column creeps toward the Danube fortress. The gate looms, and trumpets on the wall call the watch. Inside waits judgment and the knife. Within the castra, the valetudinarium lays out its quiet geometry. A broad hall wards off long corridors, drains cut straight to carry sewage away, basins rinsed with sour wine. Names are scratched on tablets. Inscriptions proclaim Medici Ordinarii and Capsare immune from fatigue. Immunes, their status fixed in law and practice. The Praefectus Castrorum controls space and supplies. He will decide which beds turn over and which men must be moved on. On a stone table, a surgeon probes for bone splinters. The choice narrows: save a limb or save the man. Bronze and fire provide the instruments of decision. Scalpels of bronze and hooks of iron clink. Wine dulls the edge and poppy resin clouds the mind, but pain remains sovereign. Hot irons cauterize vessels where ligatures fail. Stitches are pulled with boar bristles or twisted fiber. Pliny admits that remedies blunt suffering, but do not conquer it. The surgeon works by practice and rhythm. Clean limb hope, perforated belly very thin hope. Night gathers the heat beneath a man's skin, becomes a vote that fever will cast. The following days are a contest between ration and contagion. Barley porridge, sour wine, water kept clean because Polybius insisted hygiene keeps an army whole. Discipline extends to the ward. No visitors after the watch change. Bandages re-wet on schedule. Accounts docked for lost kit. Stipendium and missio causaria hang on fitness to return. The legate wants numbers, and the clerk tallies those who can bear a shield. Beds suddenly feel too few. The camp's arithmetic does not bend for sorrow. Weeks later, the pen bites wax in the tabularium. Strength reports like those from Vindolanda list absentees, hospitalized on detachment, sick on leave, and a medicus notes who needs more days. The system that is humane by intention proves brutal in practice. Every bed kept is a man not carrying a spear. Every day, a man convalesces. Ripples to the frontier. A courier arrives with a sealed order. The column shifts upriver at dawn. The valetudinarium must empty fast or be left behind. When the fortress unthreads, the wards march. Cohorts file out. Wagons creak. Temporary tabernae are lashed to carts, and the convalescents are bundled onto mules or walk with staffs. Latrine pits are dug each night, and water is set upstream because disease kills as surely as the falx. Some grave cases remain under a small guard, retrieved if fortune allows, abandoned if not. Scouts report Dacian bands on the flanks. Orders cut the soft edge. Anyone with 2 hands is to return to a shield. He straps the splinted arm and feels the scar pull under the balteus. The line closes again. Men half-healed fill gaps and learn whether bone can bear another shock. Those who fail are buried at the foot of the rampart with their names carved small. Those who cannot march are processed for missio causaria and a thin stipend. Victory smokes beyond the river, but the cost has been paid in thinner ranks, slower drill, and new scars. Another campaign waits before recovery is complete. AD 106 brings the fall of Dacia, and the stone that proclaims it the empire learns to standardize the valetudinarium across frontiers. Long wards, courtyards, latrines, so that Medici and Capsara are part of the military machine. Modern scholars see institutions settling into place, care organized to sustain campaigns, not to ease pain. Then the invisible enemy arrives. AD 165-180, the Antonine plague floods the wards. Wounded jostle with fevers, surgeons fall ill, and orderlies vanish. Dio records legions marked by death. The valetudinarium becomes a pressure point. Field triage hardens into arithmetic, and the empire, patched and vital, finds its margins fraying. Torches flare in the night as the sick press the dying, who at the next trumpet will raise the standard. What happens to a man who falls between the ranks when the falx bites at the rim of the scutum? Don Overtappy answered that question with smoke mist and the metallic tang of blood. The ditch was still being finished, and linen rolls unrolled in the rear as the line-steadied engineers had kept their tools in hand, and surgeons their knives. Pickets cleared the approach hours before the column moved forward along a corridor of men and stakes, each step measured, because the choice to move a wound or a wagon was a choice about life and the campaign itself. Commander and medic made that choice in the same breath. The centurion who roared men back toward the sorting point did so knowing the supply clerk's ledger would record every loss the legate balanced grain against life, because an army that starved could not be healed. Some wagons were stripped and lashed into crude ambulances, boards and spear shafts became brancards lashed with leather contubernails carried their own when they could. Mulians kept the slow-breathing convoy moving, Rome's second sword logistics driving the column as surely as the pilum drove forward the line. The road to the Danube fortress smelled of iron and wine, and the mules groaned under men who had been split into categories by torchlight and command. The decision was blunt salvage. The few who might bear arms soon bind and trust the rest and leave the dead where they lay if retreat was ordered. Men who could walk were shepherded ahead, those who could not were lashed to improvised brancards and loaded into hollowed carts. Perhaps 1 in 10 of the dragged off would not see the camp gate. Torches jittered on the rampage of smoke. Scouts returned with dust on their cloaks reporting Dacian bands regrouping. Evacuation must be swift, and the choice to leave a cart for grain rather than a second ambulance would be counted in lost limbs and lives. They moved as a procession of necessity. Shield boards served as beds, spear poles became handles, a contubernales carried the weight of his comrade and his own guilt. The column crept under the watchful eyes of pickets who had cleared saplings and ambush points, because the safest way to transport the wounded was a road the enemy did not own. Some wagons stayed behind for grain. One cart could feed dozens, and the legate, thinking of tomorrow's battle, could not be swayed by pity alone. The fortress gate loomed like a threshold of judgment. Trumpets on the wall called the watch, and the men on the brancards felt the ground change from plain to stone under their stretched backs. Inside the camp, the chain of command became surgical. The gate swallowed the procession and disgorged it into a compound where space, water, and labor were rationed as tightly as swords. The praefectus castrorum allocated yards and wards with the same cold pragmatism. He used to lay out ramparts. Medici and capsare moved like a braid of practiced hands. Decisions that had begun on the field now became clinical: split the limb, or save the man; cauterize, or let infection; decide, keep a bed or turn it over. The consequence of economy was immediate. One man's bread might mean another's limb. The instruments were ordinary and terrible: bronze scalpels, iron hooks, wine as antiseptic, poppy resin for a dulling that never reached painless. Hot iron cauterized vessels, ligatures bit into flesh. The surgeon worked with rhythm and with rules learned at the edge of empire, what to probe and what to close. Splints were fashioned from spear shafts, stitches were pulled with boar bristles. The smells braided together, blood, char, and sour wine. And even as lint was changed and basins rinsed, the ward became a theater of arithmetic. A limb saved kept a man in the ranks, a man saved kept a shield in the line. Polybius praised this marriage of order to fear. Efficiency itself was a weapon. Consequences rippled beyond the ward. A cart forfeited for grain meant fewer stretchers the next day. A convalescent sent back too early might fail under the next shock. Tablets would soon record each absence. The tabularium would count who was in hospital, who was sick, who could march, because every bed was a calculation that reached to the frontier and to Rome's treasury. The valetudinarium could turn men back into soldiers, but it could also see them slip into fever where the hand of the surgeon could not follow. Night brought its own verdicts. Fever took votes in the dark while clerks tallied the living. Outside the walls, the Dacian war drums waited for weakness. Inside, the wagons were rebundled and latrines dug. Convalescents, some walking, some jostled on mules, were parceled out on the march, their flat faces carved by pain and hope. Those who failed to carry a shield were processed for missio causaria, and a lean allowance those who could still lift a pilum were put back into line. Victory, when it came, would be paved with such returns and refusals, and the cost would be measured not only in banners, but in scars that would not heal by the time another campaign began. At the gate the trumpets had stopped. A trumpet on the wall still hung in the air. The column breathed in the fortress's close stone air, and inside the valetudinarium a surgeon looked down at a leg that might mend or rot. The room held the quiet of a jury about to give its sentence, and the next order would decide whether that soldier walked back into iron or was left beneath the rampart with his name carved small. Who would the campaign spare, and who would the ledger sacrifice? This was the question that followed every march, and the answer would arrive with the next dawn. AD 101 Mosia Superior near Tapi dawn smells of cold earth and the new cut of the ditch. Engineers finish the trench, while a Roman line steadies itself. Water posts are set, linen is unrolled, and the rear stretcher teams take their places. Polybius praised this union of order and fear, and here it lives. Medici and Capsarai kneel in a thin, efficient circle, because minutes will decide who names the gods later. 1,000 men stand ready, the Dacian falx glints through the mist, and the first test of the system closes fast. The first hour bleeds like a wound opened to find a pulse. The Pila fly shields lock, and a legionary's forearm is swept into a ragged ruin as the falx hacks over the scutum's rim, the metallic tang of blood on leather. A capsaria strips back the sleeve, ties a tight tourniquet above the wound, and splints with a spare pilum shaft. There is no speech, only drill. He is dragged back through the intervallum, past pack mules and water carriers. A centurion roars the line tight, and a senior medicus steps forward to choose who moves next and who is left to fate. By evening, the sorting point is a harsh geometry of need: those who can still march, those who might be saved, and those who breathe their last. Who lives, who returns to the shield, who is offered to the gods. These are not medical decisions alone, but political ones, for the legion must keep enough arms in the field. Torches flare, smoke hangs low, scouts report enemy bands regrouping, and so evacuation becomes a hurried calculus under threat. The road back to the castra is itself a theater of engineering and bargaining. Shield boards and spear poles become brancards, mules groan under improvised loads, and mullions clear the route. Rome's second sword, logistics. Some wagons have been stripped of grain to serve as ambulances, a trade-off. The legate accepts to keep men alive, but the column fed. The fortress on the Danube looms, trumpets on its walls test the sentries. Inside waits diagnosis and the surgeon's knife. Inside the castra, the valetudinarium breathes order. A broad hall ward set along long corridors, drains run straight, basins shine with sour wine. Inscriptions and archaeology from Novaesium to housesteads map the same rational plan. Medici Ordinarii and Capsarai appear by name, listed as immunes. The Praefectus Castrorum controls space and supplies, because beds must turn over or the army stalls. On a stone table, a surgeon probes for bone splinters. The choice narrows: save the limb or save the man, and the sound of the probe dictates who survives. Bronze and fire answer where words cannot. Instruments clink, bronze scalpels, iron hooks, forceps, and probes wine dulls the edges. Poppy resin will cloud the mind, but pain remains absolute, as Pliny himself conceded that remedies fall short. Hot irons cauterize bleeding vessels, ligatures bite, and splints hold stitches are pushed with boar bristles or twisted fiber. If a belly is opened, odds plummet. If a limb is cleanly severed, there is hope. The surgeon moves by practiced rhythm. The wound is closed, night arrives, and fever begins to cast its vote. When fever rises, rations and discipline become medicine. Barley porridge, sour wine, clean water, and latrines kept scrupulous. Polybius insisted on camp hygiene because contagion undoes walls, are as important as any blade. Rules govern the ward: no visitors after watch change, meat withheld, until suppuration ceases, bandages re-wet on schedule. Pay, stipendium, can be docked for lost kit. Missio causaria awaits those who cannot be rearmed. The legate wants numbers. A clerk is already counting who may bear a shield again, and the beds suddenly feel too few. Weeks later, the pen bites wax in the tabularium, and strength reports are scratched on tablets like at Vindolanda in hospital on detachment, sick on leave. A medicus notes who needs more days, and who can march. Each name moves through bureaucracy. Then a courier gallops in with a sealed order. The column shifts upriver at dawn. The valetudinarium must empty fast. Every bed freed is an arm swapped back into the line. The march rehearses the infirmary. Cohorts file out. Wagons creak. Convalescents are bundled into mule-drawn carts or hobble with staffs. Temporary tabernae become a moving infirmary, and latrine pits are dug nightly. Disease kills as surely as the falx, so a small guard remains with grave cases, either to protect a life or to mark an inevitable end. Scouts return. Dusty Dacian bands shadow the column. Orders are spare and brutal. Anyone with 2 hands returns to a shield. He straps the splinted arm. The scar pulls under the balteus as he lifts the scutum. Half-healed men fill gaps and discover whether bone will hold under new shock. Those who fail are buried by the rampart foot, with names carved small. Those who cannot march receive missio causaria and a thin stipend. Victory smokes beyond the river, but the cost is counted in slower drill and thinner ranks, and another campaign will open before these cracks close. AD 106 seals a lesson. Dacia falls, and stone speaks across the empire. Valetudinaria echo the same plan. Long wards, courtyards, latrines, an institutional grammar hardened by war. Inscriptions from Lambesis to the Rhine name Medici and Capsara. Modern scholars see the imperial machine standardize care not to soothe pain, but to sustain campaigns. The arithmetic works until it does not. When contagion rides the trade routes, medicine becomes insufficient. AD 165-180 brings the Antonine Plague, and the wards swell. Fevers crowd the beds beside the wounded. Surgeons fall ill, orderlies vanish, and the once quiet valetudinarium becomes a pressure point. Dio Cassius lists the dead by legion, as if tallying losses on a battlefield. Garrison's thin veterans are recalled early, and field triage solidifies into a brutal arithmetic. The empire endures, but its margins fray beyond the Danube, and in the east enemies sharpen teeth that medicine cannot blunt. Who will hold the line when the hospitals fill, and the legion must choose between a man and a hand? The plume of smoke over the camp, the torchlight on white bandages, and the distant sound of trumpets make the question immediate, and the answer will shape Rome's next move. AD 101 Mosia Superior near Tapi. Mist hung low over the ditch, while engineers hammered the earth, and linen was unrolled in the rear. The scene smelled of wet leather and boiled vinegar. Water posts were pegged. Spare bandages stacked. Stretcher teams, men drilled until their shoulders bled, were detailed. The decision was clear: prepare or perish. Medici briefed Capsara in a curt practice cadence because, as Polybius admired, Roman order married fear. The action that followed was silent rehearsal. Who carries whom, which mule takes which load, where the sorting point will stand. The consequence was a thin margin between control and collapse as the cornicine sounded assembly and the Dacian falx caught the first light. What decides a man's fate in those minutes will be tested before noon. AD 101. The first hour of battle. Pila were thrown, shields locked, and a legionary dropped a forearm cleanly hacked where the falx found skin over bone. A Capsarius knifed open a sleeve, lashed a tourniquet above the wound, and jammed a spare pilum shaft as a splint with wordless rhythm. The decision was immediate: stop the bleeding or lose the limb. He was dragged back through the corridor between cohorts, past mules, and tasting water toward the sorting point. The action of rescue unstitched the line. A centurion roared. The cohort closed, and a senior medicus stepped through dust to choose who moved next. The consequence was brutal arithmetic. Some men would return, some would be left to fate. By evening, the sorting point had become a raw theater, 3 heaps of men, those who could walk, those who might be saved, and those whose breath rattled away. Romans had no single word for triage, but they practiced its logic: salvage the effective bind, and wait the rest, commend dying men to the gods, because the political calculus mattered as much as the medical. Torches flared along the line. Scouts reported Dacians reforming in the gullies. The decision now was evacuation under threat or holding ground to die. The action chosen was quick: move the ambulance, seal the weak in litters, and the consequence was a hurried, ordered retreat that left the ground scorched with decisions. Along the blood road to the Danube fortress, the army made its medicine out of necessity. Shield boards and spear poles became brancards, mules groaned under piled men, and mullions shifted wagons into service. The legate faced a single military choice: strip carts to make ambulances or keep them for grain. He chose a balance, converting some wagons and leaving others for the food that kept a legion alive. The action of moving the wounded strained every rope and axle. The consequence was visible at the gate: trumpets on the wall, a watch ready to count the living from the dead. And inside the fortress awaited knives, oaths, and the next judgment. Inside the castra, the valetudinarium breathed cold order: a broad hall, small wards, off a straight corridor, drains cut to run away blood and wash water. Inscriptions and archaeology from Novaesium to housesteads mapped this plan. The praefectus castrorum held the keys to space and supply, because wards had to turn over or the army stalled. A surgeon laid a man on a stone table, probed for bone splinters with a steady hand, and was forced to decide whether to try to save a limb or to save the life the limb served. The action: careful extraction, binding, and a ration of sour wine, left consequences that were administrative as well as mortal. A bed occupied was a soldier counted out of the line. Tools clinked in the lamp glow: bronze scalpels, iron hooks, forceps that felt like small machines, while wine dulled and poppy resin clouded judgment, but not pain. Even Pliny admitted remedies could not conquer it. The decision in the ward tightened to 2 options: the gut cut, and the odds fall, or the limb clean and hope rises. The surgeon worked by practiced rhythm: hot irons to cauterize vessels, ligatures that bit like old leather, splints braced, stitches drawn with boar bristles or twisted fiber. The action was brutal precision: the wound closed, and night gathered heat under the man's skin. The consequence came with the small, terrible vote of fever. In the days that followed, routine staved off rot barley porridge, carefully strained water, set upstream sour wine for dressings, latrines kept scrupulous as Polybius instructed. The decision from above was discipline: no visitors after the watch change, bandages re-wet on schedule, no meat until suppuration ceased, because loose order meant contagion. Mullions moved, stores accounts were adjusted, and stipendium awaited those fit to return, while missio causaria was readied for the broken. The action of strictness kept beds turning, but the consequence was a ledger of human cost. The legate wanted shields back, and beds suddenly felt too few. Weeks later, the pen bit wax in the tabularium as names were tallied and strength reports sent along the frontier. Vindolanda-like tablets listed absentees, on duty in hospital, sick, on leave, and the medicus penciled who needed more days or who could march. The decision for those in authority was bureaucratic and immediate: the column moves at dawn, and the valetudinarium must empty. Couriers rode with sealed orders: the action was forced movement, and the consequence a ripple across the frontier where one missing man might mean a gap in the rampart. When the fortress unthreaded convalescents were bundled onto mule-drawn carts or walked with staff's temporary tabernae, rode the column as moving infirmaries. Latrines were dug each night, and water was set upstream of the march. The decision in the field was clear: disease kills as surely as the falx, so maintain standards on the march. The action: guards for grave cases, patched men shouldering weight, kept the army moving. The consequence: some were left with a small detachment, some were processed for discharge, and scouts came back with the dust of enemy bands on their cloaks. He strapped the splinted arm, felt the scar pull under his balteus as he raised the scutum, and the line closed around him. Men half-healed filling gaps and testing whether bone could hold a second shock. The decision for commanders was relentless: take the ground now or wait for perfect strength. They chose forward. The action was renewed drill, and march. The consequence was thin ranks, slower reactions, and graves cut at the rampart foot where names were carved small. AD 106 saw Dacia brought low and stone monuments erected. The valetudinarium plan, long wards, courtyards, dedicated staff, was spread empire-wide. Rome standardized care not to soothe suffering, but to sustain campaigns, and inscriptions from Lambesis to the Rhine set out Medici and Capsara as immunes. The decision to institutionalize medicine paid dividends, until a darker variable arrived between AD 165 and 180, the Antonine Plague swelled the wards. The action that followed was a grim inversion. The wounded jostled with fevered men, surgeons fell ill, and the valetudinarium became a pressure point, as Dio Cassius counted the dead by legion. Garrisons thinned, brutal triage hardened into arithmetic. The consequence was an empire that could win battles, but watched its margins fray. Torches still burned at the gates, but now they lit a different question: when even discipline and bronze and fire cannot hold back what rides a trade route, what does a soldier's fate become? Dawn over Tappi is a cold geometry of earth, and would the ditches finish the palisade's shadow still long, and engineers wipe frost off their tools as Medici unroll coarse linen in the rear. The decision is simple and brutal: organize or die. And so water posts are pegged, stretcher teams detailed, and capsari briefed. Horns call the line to order. The Dacian falx flashes in the mist, and the first test of Rome's system closes fast. The first hour bleeds itself into noise. The Pila fly shields lock, and a legionary takes a falx-slashed forearm. A capsarius severs a sleeve, ties a tourniquet, and sets a spare pilum shaft as a splint. No words, only the practiced choreography of pain. The metallic tang of blood and dust hangs in the throat. A centurion roars for discipline, a senior medicus decides who walks and who will be carried, and the man is dragged toward the sorting point. By torchlight, the sorting becomes a grim geometry of bodies: those who can still march, those who may yet be saved, and those who lose breath between breaths. There is no single word for triage, but there is a Roman logic: keep the fighting numbers whole and salvage what you can. Commanders decide, surgeons bind, prayers are offered. Scouts report the enemy regrouping. Evacuation must begin under threat, an ugly compromise between medicine and maneuver. The road back is a slow ribbon of makeshift brancards, shield boards and spear poles lashed into stretchers, mules groaning under the weight, contubernails carrying their own. The legate faces a ledger, and a choice strip supply carts for ambulances or risk hunger at the front. He takes the ambulances. The column crawls to the Danube fortress along a corridor secured by pickets at the gate. Trumpets sound, and judgment waits inside. Inside the castra, the valetudinarium is ordered like a miniature army. A broad hall side ward, straight drains, basins rinsing with sour wine. The praefectus castrorum apportions space and supplies, because no ward may monopolize tents without stopping the campaign. A surgeon probes for bone splinters on a stone table. The choice narrows. Attempt to save the limb or conserve men for the line, and that arithmetic will mark who lives. Tools sing, bronze scalpels, iron hooks, and forceps probes that catch at bone. Wine and poppy resin blur edges, but pain remains a sovereign. A cautery iron hisses, ligatures bite, stitches take hold with boar bristle or twisted fiber. If the belly is opened, odds plummet. If a limb is tidy, hope returns. The surgeon works by rhythm and experience. Night gathers, heat grows in the wounded man's skin, and fever begins to cast votes. Fever rations discipline. Who pays for Rome's wounds? The next days are a contest between routine and infection: barley porridge and unmilled grain ground by hand, sour wine for wounds, clean water kept upstream, latrines scrubbed as Polybius insisted. No visitors after watch change, no meat, until suppuration declares its season bandages are re-wet on schedule. Accounts are merciless deductions from stipendium for lost gear, and a missio causaria waits for the broken or the malingering. A clerk counts those fit to bear a shield again. 1 in 5 still cannot. The beds suddenly feel too few. Weeks later the pen bites wax. Strength reports roll in list by list like Vindelanda's tablets in hospital on detachment, sick on leave. A medicus ticks who needs days, who may march. The tabularium receives names and fates. A courier gallops in with a sealed order. The column lifts at dawn. The valetudinarium must empty. The system is deliberate and cold. Every patient is a calculated cost, and the frontier waits for its arithmetic. The fortress unthreads at first. Light cohorts file, wagons creak, convalescents are lashed to mules or bundled on carts. Temporary tabernae become a moving infirmary. Latrine pits are dug, nightly water taken upstream, because disease kills as surely as the falx. Some grave cases remain under small guard, a cruel mercy. Scouts return, dust streaked with news. Enemy bands shadow the march. So orders harden. Anyone with 2 hands returns to a shield. He straps the splinted arm and feels the scar pull under his balteus. He lifts the scutum and discovers whether bone and will can hold against another shock. The line closes with men, half-healed ranks thinner and drill slower. Those who fail are buried at the rampart, foot names carved small into stone, while the others are processed for missio causaria and a lean stipend. Victory smokes on the hills beyond, but the cost is counted in limp formations. By AD 106 Dacia falls and stone declares empire. Across the provinces valetudinaria share a plan, long wards, courtyards and latrines, an architecture hardened by repeated campaigns. Inscriptions from the African desert to the Rhine list Medici and Capsara as immunes fixing their place in the machine. Rome standardizes care not to end suffering, but to sustain operations. The arithmetic works until contagion outpaces surgery and calculation. When the Antonine Plague comes between AD 165 and 180, the wards swell with fevered bodies, the wounded jostle with the sick. Surgeons fall ill, orderlies vanish, and the valetudinarium, once a quiet engine of empire, becomes a pressure point. Garrison's thin veterans are recalled early, and triage hardens into a brutal counting game. Rome survives, but its margins fray, and the image of empty beds and carved names asks a harder question: what will break the empire next, the sword, or the unseen guest that travels the trade routes? AD 101 Mosia Superior near Tapi Mist lifts off the plain. The ditch smells of wet earth, and iron engineers finish the trench, while surgeons unroll linen in the rear. The decision is immediate. Water posts must be set, bandages readied, stretcher teams detailed, and the action is drill Medici brief Capsara. The consequence is grimly simple: minutes will decide lives. The cornicines sound, the Dacian falx glints in the mist, and the first test of Rome's system closes fast. AD 101, first clash at the line, the pila are thrown, shields lock, and for one man the falx finds a seam. The centurion decides who must be dragged back. Capsare rip sleeves, bind hard, and an improvised splint with a broken pilum is lashed on. 1 in 20 men falls in that first hour by rough count, and the action of retreating the wounded thins the line. The consequence: a senior medicus must choose whom to save. The forward pull is a choice between the man and the shield. AD 101 dusk at the sorting point, smoke and dust hang low, torches make faces savage. Command decides to organize a crude triage. Those who can walk, those who might be saved, those who will not return. Torches cut 3 heaps, the action is brutal efficiency. Bind the salvageable, commend the dying to the gods, leave the hopeless for watchful graves. The consequence is political. The legate keeps enough arms in formation, and the rhetorical question burns: who is worth the shield? AD 101, road to the Danube fortress, the army must move before the enemy regroups. A hard choice is made to strip some wagons into ambulances and to send mules for the weakest contubernales bear their own on improvised brancards. The action is a slow, guarded column through a cleared corridor protected by pickets and mullions. The consequence is a calculus wagons lost to carry men are fewer wagons for grain. The fortress gate looms, trumpets on the wall call the watch. Judgment awaits within. AD 101. Beneath the fort walls inside the castra, the valetudinarium breathes order. Broad halls ward straight drains, basins rinsed with sour wine. The praefectus castrorum decides how space and supplies will be apportioned. The action is the opening of lists, the allocation of beds, the naming of medici ordinarii and capsara as immunes. The consequence is immediate wards must turn over, or the army stalls, and archaeology from Nova Isium to housesteads shows this plan writ in stone. On a stone table, the surgeon probes the forward pull is a single narrowing choice: save the limb or save the man. AD 101. Inside the operating hall, bronze scalpels and iron hooks sing against bone. The smell of hot metal and the tang of poppy resin make a bitter air. The surgeon must decide whether to cauterize, ligate, or amputate. The action is precise violence. Hot irons to stop bleeding, forceps to pull splinters, stitches with boar bristles. The consequence is binary. A clean limb offers hope, a cut belly all but ends it. Night falls and fever begins to vote in the man's skin. AD 101. 100 days after the battle, the ward runs by routine. Barley porridge, sour wine, clean water, latrines kept scrupulous as Polybius recommended. The legate decides how to balance discipline and care, clerks tally losses, and stipendium is docked for missing gear. The action is paperwork as much as medicine. Who will return to duty, who will seek missio causaria. The consequence: beds feel too few, and men weigh their return against shame and survival. The forward pull is the ledger's unforgiving hand. Weeks later at the tabularium, the pen bites wax strength reports like those dug from Vindolanda itemize absentees, on detachment, in hospital, sick, on leave. The medicus notes who needs more days and who can march. The decision falls to an indifferent courier arriving with a sealed order. The action is a sealed command. The column shifts upriver at dawn. The consequence is harsh arithmetic. Every bed is a calculation that ripples to the frontier. The valetudinarium must empty fast. That night, as the fortress unthreads, cohorts file out, wagons creak, and convalescents are bundled on mule carts or walk with staffs. The camp prefect decides who travels and who stays under guard. The action creates moving tabernae that serve as an infirmary on the march, latrine pits dug, nightly water hauled upstream. The consequence: disease rides with them as surely as the enemy horse. Scouts report Dacian bands shadowing the dust. Orders cut sharp. Anyone with two hands returns to a shield. On the march back into line, a man straps a splinted arm under his balteus and takes up the scutum again. Centurions judge readiness. The action is a trial by drill and weight of shield. The consequence is brittle. Those who fail in stress are buried at the rampart foot with names carved small. Those unable to march are processed for discharge and a thin stipend. The forward pull is a line that will fill its ranks and test bone anew. AD 106. After the fall of Dacia, stone and inscription speak. Rome learns to standardize care. Governors decide that valetudinaria should follow a plan. Long wards, courtyards, latrines. And the action is institutionalization. Medici and capsara are fixed within the machine. The consequence strengthens Rome's campaigns. Scholars now read a pattern of hospitals across the empire. Yet the arithmetic is calibrated to continue fighting, not to ease suffering. The forward pull is a network that will be tested by more than spears. AD 165-180, the Antonine Years' plague rides the trade routes, and the valetudinarium becomes a pressure point. Commanders decide whether to hold garrisons or to recall veterans. The action is brutal triage, as surgeons fall ill and orderlies vanish. The consequence is strategic. Fort's thin field triage hardens into arithmetic, and the empire must fight with fraying margins. Torches gutter at the wall which will break Rome first, the enemy's blade or the invisible fever in the ward. Dawn breaks low over Tapi AD 101. Mosia Superior mist smears the Danube hills, and the Falx catches a pale glint. Engineers finish the ditch while surgeons unroll linen behind the line. The decision is immediate, and simple water posts stretcher teams bandages ready. Men are ordered to the rear by cornicines, and the moment closes like a vice. The Dacian shadow tightens. The first clash will teach whether Rome's order can keep flesh from failing. The first hour bleeds into chaos as Pila arc, and shields like a legionary falls. Forearms split where the Falx bites over the scutum. A Capsarius cuts the sleeve, ties a ligature hard, splints with a spare pilum shaft. There is no debate, only trained motion. A centurion's roar decides who lives to be dragged back. The senior medicus must choose who moves next. Those seconds will be counted in lives. By evening, the sorting point becomes 3 heaps: men who can walk, men who might yet be saved, and men gone to the gods. There is no single Latin word for triage, but Polybius praised the Roman logic that married order to fear. Commanders now choose salvage over sentiment. Torches flare. Scouts report Dacian bands reforming. The decision is to evacuate under pressure, or be cut off. Men shuffle into ranks, feeling the weight of calculus as keenly as any spear. The blood road to camp is a slow litany of creak and groan. Shield boards and spearpaw poles make brancards. Mules stagger under carted bodies. Contubernails shoulder what they can. Logistics govern the choice. Mulians and wagons must carry both grain and wounded, a painful trade. The column slips along a corridor cleared by pickets. Every mile is a command decision between food and lives. The fortress gate looms as trumpets mark the threshold of judgment. Inside, the castra order breathes through stone. The valetudinarium is a broad hall with side wards, drains cut to run, clear basins rinsed with sour wine. Inscriptions and barrack record-keeping show Medici Ordinarii and Capsarii listed as immunes. The Praefectus Castrorum controls space and supplies. He decides who gets a bed, and who must wait. Beds are counted like spears. There are never enough. Bronze scalpels and iron hooks chink under oil lamps. Wine dulls poppy resin clouds, but pain remains absolute. The surgeon probes for bone splinters with practiced rhythm. Hot irons cauterize ligatures, bite stitches, take boar bristle or twisted fiber. If the belly is open, the odds darken. If a limb is clean, hope rises. Pliny admitted remedies cannot abolish suffering. The surgeon's decision, save limb or save man, becomes the stake on which a life will turn. Fever is the ward's true enemy, not the Falx alone. Rations, barley porridge and watered wine. Armeted latrines are dug and kept raw clean as Polybius insisted, because filth kills. Discipline governs feeding, visiting hours, and who moves next accounts dock pay for lost kit. Stipendium waits on fit return, or a missio causaria is processed. The legate wants numbers more than comfort. Clerks count those who can bear a shield, and the beds feel suddenly finite. Weeks pass, and the pen bites wax. Strength reports are compiled like the tablets from Vindolanda that list who is present and who is absent. A medicus writes who needs more days. Names cross to the tabularium, and bureaucrats make human lives into tallies. The system is engineered with humane hands and harsh ends. Each bed freed means one more man at the rampart. A courier gallops in the column, moves upriver at dawn. The valetudinarium must empty fast. The fortress unthreads at first. Light cohorts file out. Wagons creak. Convalescents are bundled into mule-drawn carts or limp with staffs. Temporary tabernae fold and march as a moving infirmary. Latrine pits are dug nightly, and the water is set upstream. Scouts ride back with dust on their cloaks. Dacian bands shadow the column. Orders cut through morning smoke. Anyone with 2 hands returns to a shield, and the army turns its sick into soldiers again, or leaves them to fate. He straps his splinted arm, the scar tugging under the Balteus, as he lifts the scutum. A century of roughly 80 men watches the attempt. Men half-healed fill gaps and discover whether bone will hold in another clash. Those who fail are buried at the rampart foot, with names carved small. Those who cannot march are processed for discharge, and a thin stipend. Beyond the river, the victory hills smoke, but the cost is counted in slower drill and thinner ranks. Rome learns that war demands an apparatus of care. By AD 106, with Dacia subdued, stone and inscription show valetudinaria laid out from lambecies to the Rhine, long wards, courtyards, latrines, a network institutionalized by the needs of campaign. Modern scholars see this as a system settling into place. Rome standardizes care to keep armies fighting, not to ease pain. The arithmetic of manpower is durable until contagion begins to outnumber wounds. Then the great unknown arrives, the Antonine Plague, AD 165-180, when fevers swelled wards and surgeons themselves fell ill. Beds become contagion points, garrisons thin, and surgeons vanish. Field triage hardens into brutal arithmetic. Dio Cassius counts the dead by legion as if they were columns of a ledger. The empire survives, but its margins fray, and the next century will ask whether medicine can ever be the match for pestilence sweeping down the roads Rome built. What if the enemy was not the falx but the fever that follows it? The image lingers, torches guttering over a row of pale faces, a medicus bent under the heat of a lamp, and a courier galloping off with the name sealed in wax. Who will be left when the column reaches the Danube and the next campaign drums its summons? AD 101, Mosia Superior near Tapi, dawn breaks on a line of men whose sleep smells of straw and iron. Engineers finish the ditch, water posts are planted, Medici unroll linen, while capsarii fold their knives. The decision is immediate and political as much as medical. Keep the rhythm of drill, for Polybius admired Roman order because it made fear useful. Men check harness, the cornicine sound in minutes, sometimes one or two, will decide who stays alive. The missed parts and a Dacian falx flashes, the choice to hold or to fall back snaps open like a trap. AD 101, the first hour, Pila fly shields lock into a living wall, and a man topples with a forearm ripped by the falx. A capsarius cuts his sleeve, binds high above the wound, and fashions a splint from a broken pilum shaft. No words, only practiced motion. The centurion roars a command, someone must be dragged through the cohort interval to the sorting point. The decision belongs to the senior medicus, who can return, who must be carried, who will not. Action follows with the cruel precision of training. Consequence, the line trembles, a gap yawns, and discipline must be forced closed. Evening, the sorting point by torchlight, smoke and dust make a false dusk, and the surgeons organize men into three heaps: those who will walk, those who might be saved, and those whose breath grows thin. There is no single Latin for triage. There is instead a logic: salvage the useful first, bind, and watch the rest, and send last rites to the dying. The decision is military as much as humane. Too many beds means fewer shields. Torches flare, scouts bring news of enemy regrouping. The action is a hurried evacuation under threat, with the consequence that some are left to die where they fall. The road to the Danube fortress becomes a blood road. Contubernales lift their own brancards, and spear poles are lashed into stretchers, and mullions groan with overloaded beasts. The legate must decide which wagons become ambulances and which carry grain, a logistical calculus that will shape lives. Carts are stripped, mules rerouted, men strapped down in shifting rows. Consequence, arrival at the fortress gate brings judgment, and the knife inside space and supplies will determine whether bone is mended or marrow wasted. Inside the castra, the valetudinarium breathes order, a long hall, side wards, drains, cut straight basin, smelling faintly of sour wine. Inscriptions and barracks plans show Medici ordinarii and capsara. As immunes, the praefectus castrorum holds keys to beds and stores. The decision falls to him and the chief surgeon when a patient is carried in: probe for bone shrapnel or accept amputation. Action on the stone table is quick, and consequence is stark: save a limb and risk a man's life, or cut and guarantee a soldier's return to duty. Bronze scalpels and iron hooks clink in a practiced rhythm, wine and poppy resin dull the edges, but pain is still a hammer. The surgeon chooses cauterized vessels with a hot iron tie. Ligatures pull splinters with blunt forceps. Stitch with boar bristle and twisted fiber. Sensory detail pierces memory. The hot hiss of iron, the sour tang of wine on cloth, the metallic taste in a throat. Action ends with a closed wound. Consequence arrives. As fever a patient's skin grows hot, the ward exhales worry. And the next decision is whether to rearrest infection or record another bed lost. Days become a litany of barley porridge, and regulated care latrines are scrubbed because Polybius and later writers insist camp cleanliness saves more men than heroics. The officer's ledger watches men as closely as any medicus pay may be capped, and missio causaria looms for those unfit to march. The decision is administrative as much as clinical. Who returns to the standard, who must be written out? Action is routine. Dressing change and rationing. Consequence is a thinned roster and the unmistakable pressure of a column that must move. Weeks later, tablets and tallies bite wax and ink. Vindalanda-like reports itemize the absent, the sick, the on leave, names that cross into the tabularium. A medicus annotates who needs more convalescence and who can march with a staff. The decision is arithmetic. Beds are finite, frontiers urgent. The action of clerks and couriers spreads the governor's order. Consequence, the valetudinarium must empty fast because the campaign timetable does not wait on healing. When the fortress unthreads at dawn, cohorts file and wagons creak. Canvas tabernae are lashed onto carts to make a moving infirmary. The decision to march wounded or to leave them behind is made where scouts meet dust. Disease travels with the column as surely as spear and shield. Action keeps streams of convalescents moving upstream. Latrine pits dug, water hauled ahead. Consequence, some graves are dug nightly, guarded by a handful of men. The army loses strength, but keeps its forward edge. What will bone do against metal? He straps the splinted arm, the scar tugs beneath his balteus as he raises his scutum. Half-healed men file back into ranks. 1 in 10 will limp for weeks, some never again bear a pilum. The decision is simple and unromantic. Anyone with 2 hands returns to a shield. Action is the tightening of straps, the slow return to drill. Consequence is immediate and brutal. Those who fail are buried at the rampart foot with names carved small. Those who cannot march take missio causaria and a thin stipend. The line closes, but it is slower, and victory smells of smoke mixed with iron. AD 106, after Dacia falls, Rome's valetudinaria share a plan from Lambesis to the Rhine. Long wards, courtyards, latrines. An institutional network meant to sustain prolonged war. Inscriptions name Medici and Capsara. The state fixes status and pay because the machinery of empire needs repair shops for men. The decision is systemic, standardized care to keep campaigns supplied with men, not to soothe suffering. Action builds hospitals into the infrastructure. Consequence is an arithmetic that works until contagion outweighs wounds. AD 165-180, the Antonine Years' plague rides the trade routes and swells the wards. Doctors fall ill, orderlies vanish. The valetudinarium becomes a pressure point. The decision to recall veterans early or to accept thinner garrisons is made in panic and ledger. Action becomes ruthless. Triage. Consequence is a frayed frontier, and new coalitions testing Rome's worn edges. The last image lingers, beds full to overflowing, torches guttering, and a question that will not leave the listener. What happens when medicine itself becomes the battle line? Dawn over tapis smelled of wet wool and iron. It is AD 101, Mosia Superior. The mist hangs low on the ridge, and the Dacian falx flashes like a promise. Behind the front line, a medicus briefs. A Capsarius engineers finish. The ditch water posts are set, and stretcher teams are detailed because minutes will decide who returns to shield and who does not. Polybius's praise of order married to fear is here made concrete. Drill is the decision, and the legions act. The first clash will test whether Rome's logistics can turn bleeding men into soldiers again, and the test closes fast as the cornicines sound assembly. The first hour bleeds in a dozen languages. A pilum strikes a scutum bucks, and a man with a slashed forearm goes down. A capsarius cuts linen, ties a tourniquet, and splints the limb with a spare pilum shaft. No speeches, only practiced hands. He is dragged through the interval between cohorts toward a sorting point past pack mules and water carriers, because saving a life is also saving a place in the line. A centurion roars the line steady. The senior medicus must choose who moves next. Their decision is tactical as much as humane. Keep enough arms for the next push. By evening, the sorting point is a hard geometry, those who can walk, those who might be saved, and those whose breath rattles away. There is no single Latin for triage, yet the Romans possess a hard logic. Move the salvageable first, bind, and wait the rest. Commend the dying to the gods. Torches throw, cruel light smoke smears, faces scouts report the Dacians regrouping. Command chooses evacuation under threat rather than stay and be cut off, and men are lashed onto brancards to be hauled toward the nearest fortress. The blood road to camp is a lesson in logistics as much as pity. Contubernales lift their own muleteers and wagons, open a corridor along a pre-cleared track to the Danube fortress. Some carts have been stripped to serve as ambulances, others keep grain. The legate decides between sustenance and salvage. The column creeps under watchful trumpets. The fortress gate promises shelter and the judge's knife. Inside, the choice is surgical and blunt limb salvaged, man preserved, or the limb forfeit to save manpower. Within the castra, the valetudinarium admits a different kind of order. Long wards run from a broad hall. Courtyards and latrines are planned drains. Channel washwater basins gleam with sour wine. Inscriptions from the Rhine to Lambesis name Medici and Capsari, fixing their status as immunes. The praefectus castrorum controls supplies and space, because beds must turn or the army stalls. On a stone table, a surgeon probes for bone splinters, and the choice narrows again: save limb or save man. Bronze and fire supply the surgeon's speech. Bronze scalpels sing against iron forceps. Wine dulls the edge and poppy resin clouds consciousness, but pain remains a constant. Hot irons cauterize vessels. Ligatures bite. Stitches are drawn with boar bristles or twisted fiber. If the belly is open, the odds fall like winter leaves. If the limb is clean, hope rises in slow, stubborn increments. The surgeon works by rhythm learned under campaign tents. The wound is closed, and night brings the fever's first votes. Fever is where arithmetic meets fate. Rations, barley porridge, sour wine, clean water, return in scheduled rations, because Polybius taught that camp hygiene keeps men alive as surely as walls keep enemies out. Bandages are rewetted on a timetable. Latrines are cleaned. Visiting is curtailed after the watch change. Discipline is the secondary medicine, because the legate needs numbers. Accounts and pay may be docked for lost gear. Men are counted in strength reports. When beds run thin, the ward becomes a ledger of the frontier's capacity. Tablets and tallies translate wounds into policy. Wax tablets from places like Vindolanda show names crossed into the tabularium. In hospital, on detachment, sick on leave. A medicus notes who needs days, and who can march. The clerk moves columns of men like chess pieces. The system is designed to be mercifully efficient and ruthlessly practical. A courier arrives with an order sealed in wax. The column shifts upriver at dawn. The valetudinarium must empty fast, thus the decision to march is made in the ink-stained quiet of a record room. Marching the wards is improvisation that has become routine. Cohorts unthread from the fortress. Wagons creak. Convalescents are lashed to carts or hobble with staffs. Temporary tabernae form a moving infirmary. Latrine pits are dug. Nightly water is taken upstream, because disease kills as surely as the falx. Some grave cases remain under a small guard, left behind as much by strategy as by compassion. Scouts return with dust. Dacian bands shadow the column. Orders cut. Anyone with 2 hands returns to a shield. Back to iron. Men discover the cost. He straps his splinted arm under the balteus and lifts his scutum. The scar pulls as he takes his place in the line. Men half-healed fill gaps and learn whether bone can withstand another shock. Those who fail are buried at the rampart foot with a small carved name. Those unfit receive missio causaria and a thin stipend. Victory smokes across the river, but the cost is counted in slower drill-thinner ranks, and a manpower drain that no triumph painted on stone can entirely disguise. AD 106 Dacia falls and stone speaks in a new language of administration. Valetudinaria across provinces share a blueprint, long wards, courtyards, latrines, and inscriptions fix Medici and Capsari within the imperial machine. Scholars such as Clifford Ando and Adrian Goldsworthy see institutions settling into place care standardized not to ease pain, but to sustain campaigns. The arithmetic seems to work. Until contagion upstages sword and spear, new recruits arrive raw while old scars ache, and an enemy without a falx rides the trade routes. What if the hospitals that stitched the legions together also carried death with every cart? In AD 165-180, the Antonine Plague proves the feared answer. Fever swells the ward's wounded, and fever jostles surgeons fall ill, orderlies vanish, and the valetudinarium becomes a pressure point where the frontier thins. Dio Cassius marks losses by legion garrisons empty and veterans are recalled early. The empire survives, but its margins fray, leaving a final image, a rank of beds under torchlight, a surgeon's hand trembling, and a courier mounting a horse with a fever in his saddle. AD 101 Tapi Mosia Superior, the morning is metal and mud as engineers finish a ditch, and linen for bandages is unrolled in the rear. A cohort of roughly 480 men steadies under the cornicines call water posts, our pegged stretcher teams are detailed, and survival is made of drill and repetition. Medici brief Capsari, because minutes will decide who breathes and who does not. The Dacian falx glints in the mist, and the order chosen now will meet steel within an hour. The Pila fly shields lock a legionary keels over with a slashed forearm. A Capsarius slits the sleeve, binds hard above the wound, and uses a spare pilum shaft as an improvised splint. No words, only trained hands. A senior medicus strides past the line, and with a single assessment divides men into who will be carried and who will be left on the ground to hope. The line wavers, a centurion's roar muscles them back, but the first hour has already started to bleed men away. By torchlight, the sorting point becomes mercilessly clear: men who can march, men who might be saved, and men whose breath rattles away. Rome had no single word for triage, but Polybius praised the logic. Salvage the fit, bind the rest, commend the dying. This is a military choice as much as a medical one. Keep enough arms for the next line. Torches flare, scouts report the enemy regrouping, evacuation must begin under threat, and choices made at the fire will echo on the march. The blood road to the Danube fortress is a procession of shield boards and spear poles, mule trains clipped to a corridor cleared by pickets. Mulians pull carts converted into ambulances. Some wagons are stripped of grain to carry the wounded, and arithmetic of supply and skin the legate cannot evade. Mules grown contubernales shoulder their friends, and the fortress gate grows larger with each step. The decision to sacrifice stores for men is immediate. Inside the gate waits judgment, a knife, and the slow business of recovery. Within the castra, the valetudinarium breathes a brittle order, a broad hall, wards off corridors, drains cut to run true basins rinsed in sour wine. Inscriptions name Medici Ordinarii and Capsari, as immunes. Archaeology from Novaesium to Housesteads confirms the plan. The Praefectus Castrorum controls space and supply, because wards must turn over or the army grinds to a halt. A surgeon lays instruments on stone probes for bone splinters and faces the narrowing choice: save limb or save the man. Bronze scalpels click against iron hooks, forceps and probes catch torchlight. Wine dulls the edge, poppy resin clouds reason, but pain remains sovereign. Pliny admitted remedies often failed to conquer it. Hot iron's cauterized ligatures bite like leather splints hold, and stitches are drawn with boar bristles or twisted fiber. The surgeon moves in a practiced rhythm, the wound is closed. But night brings another hazard. Heat gathers in the man's skin and fever begins to vote on his survival. In the days that follow, discipline is a kind of medicine: barley porridge, sour wine, water kept clean, latrines watched as Polybius insisted for a healthy camp. No visitors after the watch change, bandages re-wet on strict schedules, and a clerk records absences because stipendium hinges on fitness or missio causaria. Order in the ward mirrors order on the rampart, yet the beds feel too few, and the legate's ledger grows less forgiving by the hour. Weeks pass and pens bite wax as strength reports are tallied, names from Vindolanda-like tablets crossed to the tabularium. A medicus notes who needs more days, and who can march. The system is humane by design and brutal by consequence. Then a courier arrives sealed in wax with a new order. The column shifts upriver at dawn. The valetudinarium must empty fast, and men who have not finished healing are told to be ready to move. The fortress unthreads at first, light cohorts file. Wagons creak and convalescents are strapped to mules or march with staffs. Tabernae are lashed to wagons and become a moving infirmary. Latrine pits are dug nightly, and water is drawn upstream because disease kills as surely as the falx. Some grave cases remain under small guards. Hope preserved by watchmen. Scouts bring dust on their cloaks and news of enemy bands. Orders tighten. Anyone with 2 hands returns to a shield. He straps the splint beneath the balteus and feels the scar pull as he lifts his scutum. The line closes with men half-healed, filling gaps that should not exist. Those who cannot march are buried at the rampart foot with small carved names. Others are processed for missio causaria and a reduced stipend. Victory hills smoke beyond the river, but the cost is written in slower drill, and thinner ranks. Another campaign begins before recovery is complete. AD 106, after Dacia falls and Great Stone speaks of conquest, Rome's valetudinaria share an architectural grammar. Long wards, courtyards, latrines aligned. Inscriptions from Lambeses to the Rhine fix Medici and Capsara in the machine. Modern scholars see institutions settling into place, care standardized to sustain campaigns, not to abolish suffering. The arithmetic holds until a different arithmetic arrives. Disease that travels trade routes as readily as armies, and new recruits come raw while old scars ache. AD 165-180. The Antonine plague arrives like a rumor that will not die. The wards swell, wounded jostle, with fevered men, and beds become contagion. Dio Cassius marks the dead by the legion as surgeons fall ill, and orderlies vanish. The valetudinarium, once Rome's quiet strength, becomes a pressure point. What happens when the healers fall ill? Garrison's thin veterans are recalled early, and field triage hardens into a brutal arithmetic, where one man's recovery costs another's enlistment. The empire survives, but margins fray beyond the Danube, and in the east old enemies gather, and the century to come will ask questions medicine cannot answer. Today a wounded soldier is flown to surgery in Rome. Survival hung on drill, quick sorting, and a fort hospital. We explain the path from field to bed, and why it shaped campaigns. People picture crude care. Evidence from Polybius and Vindolanda shows a planned, harsh system. What did he face in the first hour, and who chose his fate? AD 101. Dawn finds the ridge above Tapi suffused with mist. Engineers tamp the final ditch, while the smell of iron and wet linen drifts from the rear. Decision is swift, and absolute. Water posts must stand, bandages be ready, stretcher teams be named. Order married to fear, as Polybius admired of Roman camps. The cornicines call assembly in the pale light. The curved Dacian falx flashes like a promise. The first test of Rome's system approaches, and every man feels the coming calculus of life and limb. The first hour bleeds hot and sharp. The pila fly shields lock, and a legionary collapses with a shredded forearm where the falx came over the scutum. A capsarius cuts the sleeve ties tight above the wound, and splints with a spare pilum shaft. No words, only drill. Decision is immediate: drag him through the interval between cohorts or leave him to fight. They choose preservation. Men form a corridor, and the wounded are borne back past mules and water carriers toward the sorting point while the line grinds on, and the centurion's roar presses the moment forward. By evening, the sorting point smells of smoke and dust, and wine used as first anesthetic. The command chooses the salvageable go first, the doubtful wait, the dying are commended to the gods. Romans had no single word for triage, but they practiced a ruthless logic: keep enough arms in the line. Torches flare, scouts report Dacians regrouping. The action is evacuation under pressure. Stretcher bearers bundle, wagons peel away, and the decision to abandon some gear is paid with a price in vulnerability. The consequence is a moving hospital and a thinning defensive depth. The blood road to camp is a corridor of groans and creaking wood. Shield boards and spear poles serve as brancards. Contubernails carry the wounded in pairs. Mules strain under improvised litters. The commander's choice is logistical: strip a cart for an ambulance or keep it for grain. Trajan famously ordered his own linen cut into bandages when supplies failed. A detailed deal preserves. The column shuffles toward the Danube fortress along a pre-cleared lane. Every mile is a bargaining of lives against supplies, and the fortress gate promises both refuge and a surgeon's knife. Inside the castra, the valetudinarium breathes a disciplined air. Broad hall side wards straight drains basins of sour wine. The praefectus castrorum calculates space and supplies. Medici and capsara are listed as immune so the wards can turn. Decision becomes arithmetic: save the limb or save the man. On a stone table, a surgeon probes for bone fragments, feeling through the cloth. The action that follows, amputation or reconstruction, will ripple across ranks and campaigns. Bronze and fire answer the surgeon's decision. Instruments clink: bronze scalpels, iron hooks, forceps. Wine dulls the edge, poppy resin clouds consciousness, yet pain remains a witness Pliny could not fully soothe. The surgeon chooses cautery for bleeding vessels, ligatures for arteries, splints for shattered bone. Sutures are often twined fiber or boar bristles. If the belly is opened, odds fall. If the limb is clean, hope steadies. The consequence is immediate: some live into fever, others into convalescence, and the night watches the tally of suffering. Fever becomes the daily adversary. Rations are thin barley porridge, sour wine, and clean water. Latrines are maintained because Polybius insisted camp hygiene saves more men than heroics. Discipline governs the ward: no visitors after change. Bandages rewetted on schedule. Accounts docked for lost kit. The legate demands numbers: a clerk counts those fit to bear a shield. The harsh decision: who returns to the ranks, turns beds into statistics, and every healed arm is a political as much as medical resource. Weeks later, the tablets bite wax. Strength reports like those from Vindolanda itemize absentees in hospital on detail, sick on leave. A medicus notes who marches, who needs time, names crossed to the tabularium. The action of administration sorts men for war or discharge. The consequence is stark: every occupied bed deprives the field of muscle, and a courier's sealed order can force an entire infirmary to empty by dawn, turning recovery into a matter of timetable and command. When the camp moves, the wards march. Cohorts file, wagons creak, convalescents are lashed to carts or walk with staffs. Temporary tabernae become a rolling infirmary. Command decisions prioritize the column's mobility. Latrines are dug nightly, water run upstream, and grave cases remain under small guard. The consequence is exposure. Disease rides with the road, and scouts report Dacian bands shadowing the march. Orders come down like iron: anyone with 2 hands returns to a shield. Back in the line, the healed learn whether bone and scar can hold against fresh shock. He straps the splinted arm, the scar tugs under the balteus. The action of rejoining is raw. Roughly 1 in 10 men bears a visible sign of surgery. Some fail silently and are buried at the rampart's foot with small carved names. Others are processed for missio causaria and a thin stipend. The consequence echoes Victory Hill's smoke beyond the river, but the army's depth is thinner, and future maneuvers feel the cost. Empire-wide Rome learns to standardize care. By AD 106, Dacia's fall turns camps into architecture valetudinaria, repeat a plan from Lambesis to the Rhine. Inscriptions fix Medici and Capsara, as part of the machine scholars see institutions settling into place. Decision here is systemic care is organized to sustain campaigns rather than to solace men. The action creates a network that preserves legions, until contagion arrives and arithmetic fails where medicine cannot. When plague comes, the wards unravel. In the Antonine years, fever fills beds once reserved for blade and fracture wounded and sick jostle. Beneath the same roof surgeons fall ill, orderlies disappear. The decision to recall veterans or compress convalescents becomes routine. The action is brutal arithmetic. The consequence is strategic garrisons, thin borders fray, and an empire that counted on its valetudinaria finds some enemies are not pieces of iron or wood, but invisible currents traveling the roads. What then is the true cost of Rome's punctured sleeve? The blade and the fever both. The answer waits in the camps, in the slow unlinking of men from shields, in the small carved names beneath the rampart, and in the empty stretchers that cough dust as a column moves on. The valley beyond Tapi keeps its smoke. The question rides with the column, who will count the living when the next dawn comes and the falx rises again. A shout splits the mist as the Pila arc and drop the line locks into its practiced geometry, and the world narrows to wood, leather, and iron. A curved Dacian falx flashes over the rim of a shield, and the man beside him keels with his forearm streaming, the skin torn back like a flag. There is no pause for pity, only drill. A Capsarius draws his knife with the same economy as a soldier draws a gladius. He slashes the sleeve, presses cloth above the ruined artery, and winds a tourniquet tight, then lays a spare pilum shaft, about 4 feet long, along the limb as splint. No speech, only the choreography of habit. Cut, bind, stabilize. Decision follows immediately and is made where it must be made, not by sentiment, but by calculation. Can this man return to the line in the hour that follows, or must he be carried back and counted against the legate's strength? The choice is political as well as medical. Keep enough arms at the front, enough bodies to hold ground. And so, the senior medicus in the rear has to answer in seconds. Action becomes transport. 2 comrades sling their mate between them. Muleteers and water carriers part like tides. He is dragged through the interval between cohorts, past stacked pila and groaning pack mules, past a water post where men snatch cupped hands of cold Danubian flow. The ground is a smear of churned earth, and blood, the smell of shaken iron and sour wine, hangs in the vapor. A centurion helmet shining and voice raw roars, the line closed, and the geometry of battle reasserts itself. 4 ranks forward steady, shields forward steady. At the threshold between fight and camp, a ritual repeats as old as Rome's order. The Capsara and a few Medici decide who moves next. Consequence spreads outward like a bruise. The soldier with the splinted forearm is not the only casualty in that first hour. Dozens, perhaps scores, will fall wounded. Some will be stunned, but mendable, others mortally hurt. The immediate effect is tactical. The line wavers where men have been stripped of shields, and gaps have to be closed by a sergeant's shove or the centurion's curse. The logistical consequence is immediate and concrete. Bandages are used at a rate that presto leaves the rear low. An officer is forced to unbolt his own linen to make strips. Mules that should carry grain now bear the living, and the legion's second sword is the wagon train repurposed as ambulance. The senior medicus triages without a single pious ceremony. Those who can walk will march back to a muster point and be re-equipped if possible. Those who cannot are lashed to shield boards and pole stretchers and sent under guard. The worst are wrapped, named, and laid aside with a prayer to whatever God will take them. This is not the mercy of a modern hospital, but the arithmetic of survival. 1 man bound above the wound can mean 10 more at the line the next hour. A new decision presses in as fast as the first. Do you stop the fight to clear the corridor, risking a renewed enemy push, or keep men forward and let the injured lie until the immediate danger passes? The answer is shaped by Roman discipline and the drill Polybius admired, assembly water post stretcher teams, and by the character of the enemy. If Dacian bands press, evacuation accelerates into a brutal timetable. If the line holds, the injured are consolidated, and the valetudinarium's shuttle begins to hum. Action and consequence conspire into a choreography of cruelty and care. The capsari work with bearing hands, not tears. A medicus counts pulses as a centurion counts shields. In human terms, the numbers are intimate. One pilum shaft becomes a man's splint. One bandage can save a limb. 1 minute can decide whether bleeding stops or a life ebbs. Sensory detail locks memory. The wet slap of a sling dropping a man, the metallic tang at the back of the throat, the rasp of cloth over wound, and the scene hardens into policy. The column must hold the camp, must not be clogged with bodies. The legate needs shields more than stories. So the wounded are filtered, named on wax tablets strapped to planks, and moved under watchful eyes toward the sorting point, where a senior medicus strides in and chooses who goes next. Who will he send forward? The splinted arm is a promise and a wager. If the man can lift a shield and grip a sword, he will be sent back to iron. If not, he will be counted, paid a fraction, and perhaps discharged later. The forward movement in that hour, of bandage, of pole stretcher, of men closing ranks under a centurion's cry, determines more than lives. It shapes victory and loss. The calculus of an empire that treats care as an instrument of war. The capsarius tightens a binding. The man blinks, tastes iron, and the medicus looks up, weighing flesh against the next command. The line steadies, but the question hangs: will the splinted arm hold when the falx comes down again? AD 101, Mosia Superior near Tapi Mist lies low on the earth as engineers finish the ditch and surgeons unroll linen in the rear. Water posts are pegged into the soil, bandages stacked like ready flags. Stretcher teams practiced until the motion is muscle memory. Exactly the sort of order Polybius admired, where discipline and dread make a single instrument. The Medici brief the capsari in curt knots of speech. Minutes, not rhetoric, will decide who lives. The cornicines sound, and the Dacian falx flashes through the haze. The system that has been built for wounds now faces its first test. The first hour bleeds with simple geometry. Pila flies shields, like a legionary falls with a forearm hacked through where the falx finds the scutum's rim. A capsarius slits the sleeve, binds hard above the wound, and when no splint exists, he lashed a pilum shaft into place. No talk, only drill. He is dragged back through the interval between cohorts, past mules and water carriers toward the sorting point. The centurion roars them closed. A senior medicus steps under the smoke and makes the choice that separates soldiers from statistics. By evening, the sorting point is a theater of decisions. 3 heaps form: men who can walk, men who might be saved, men whose breath rattles away. Romans had no single word for triage. They had a logic: move the salvageable, bind the rest, commend the dying to the gods. What does Rome do with the dying? It weighs them against shields and standards, because the line must not break. Torches flare, the scent of pitch and iron hangs in the air. Scouts ride back with dust on their cloaks. Dacians are regrouping, and the choice hardens into evacuation.